In part two of this presentation on colonial architecture, we'll start with a brief discussion of proportion systems employed in facade designs. And we'll turn once more to the width house. Except for its modillion cornice, the house is essentially devoid of ornament. It achieves its aesthetic quality mainly through its careful proportions. What at first glance appears as a simple facade is actually a complex essay in geometry. We see in this analytical diagram how the facade relies on both a right and equilateral triangle and other geometric forms for its proportions. Such consideration of geometry in facade design was common practice in the 18th century. This is documented in the title page illustration of Robert Morris's Rural Architecture, a 1750 English pattern book available in the American colonies. If we look closely at the facade, we see that the basis of its proportions is a series of circles. When these proportion systems are ignored, we get a less than satisfactory product. This real estate ad attempts to promote a residence as a replica of the George Wythe house. We can see the superficial resemblance, but it's immediately apparent that its designer was unaware of the Wythe house's proportion system. So if some recent colonial revival houses look a bit off, it's because their designers were ignorant of the role of geometrical relationships in facade design. So it's encouraging to encounter a house where the designer was aware of the subtle proportion systems and refinements essential to the beauty of colonial architecture. Such awareness was apparent in this adaptation of the Wythe house, a house in Georgia. Using a measured elevation for a reasonably high-style house, it's possible to undertake your own analysis of a facade's geometry. I tried this for Minokan, that at first glance appears to be an unassuming 1770s plantation house with flanking dependencies. In fact, I got carried away with the process. Now, I certainly can't say that the builder went this far in working out the design, but the diagram shows that the geometry is there. I want now to make a few observations about scale of various colonial houses. Looking at the scale figure next to Minokan, we may be surprised to see that the house is larger than we might think. By contrast, the scale of a typical Cape Cod house is very small. Ceiling heights were kept low to preserve warmth. Nonetheless, the compact one-story Cape Cod dwelling became a generic American house form. It has inspired innumerable adaptations across the country. Many realtors describe any simple A-frame house as a Cape Cod. This particular dwelling, the Isaac Small House, served as the model for a 1920s commercial design published by the National Plan Service and widely distributed. Even a more substantial New England house is characterized by compact proportions. An average height person would have no trouble peering into the first-floor windows of this house. Another defining feature of many New England colonial houses seen in this example is the center chimney stack. This one stack tops a massive masonry structure in the middle of the house, serving as many as a half-dozen fireplaces. Having all these flues funnel into a single stack helps preserve much residual heat. We compare this with a typical middling colonial Virginia plantation house. Although appearing unpretentious, if not modest, its scale is fooling. Here I'm serving as a scale figure. Virginia's hot summers required high ceilings. Instead of a center chimney, the house has exterior in-chimneys, allowing an unobstructed center passage for through ventilation. The center passage was the coolest part of a southern house in summer. The scale increases in high-style houses such as Wilton. This Virginia plantation mansion is a classic example of American Georgian architecture, and the scaled figure in the drawing reveals the generous size of the house. Now I want to digress here for a brief discussion about window treatments. Note that Wilton is absent of any exterior shutters. This is for two reasons. First, we see rub brick dressings on either side of each window, a decorative highlight made with lighter color, smooth surface brick. It would be undesirable to hide this embellishment with shutters. Second, brick houses had walls of sufficient thickness to allow for interior shutters that could be folded into the window jambs, as in Wilton's parlor. In almost all cases, the interior shutters of colonial brick houses were made with solid panels for security. Louvered interior shutters are a Victorian fashion. While shutters are not applied to the exteriors of most colonial brick houses, they are a common feature of wood frame houses. Wooden houses haven't walls of sufficient thickness to accommodate interior shutters, and many of the exterior shutters were solid panels for security. Towards the middle of the 18th century, louvered shutters became increasingly popular. Louvered shutters not only provided some security when closed, they also enabled ventilation. Interestingly, early records often refer to these exterior louvered shutters as Venetian blinds, a term also eventually applied to interior shades of louvers operated with cords and pulleys, as we know. The term Venetian blind, of course, derives from the louvered blinds or shutters of Italy, found on buildings throughout that country, including Venice. Colors for exterior shutters vary from white to dark brown. Perhaps the most popular color was green. We see a pale green on this Williamsburg house. The pigment often used for green color is called verdigris. Verdigris pigment is derived from applying acetic acid, often vinegar, to copper plates, which reacts with the copper. When freshly applied, verdigris is a bright green, a color replicated in the shutters of James Madison's Montpelier. However, natural verdigris pigment will darken over time, eventually becoming almost black. We saw this dark hue in part 1 of this presentation on the panel shutters of the Moore House. And because many famous colonial houses such as Westover were hung with exterior shutters in the 19th century, this image of black-green shutters against red brick walls became very appealing to designers of colonial revival houses in the 20th century, where the use of near-black of aged verdigris is omnipresent. The employing of rub brick dressings around exterior windows of brick houses all but ceased in the late 18th century. This encouraged exterior louvered shutters becoming standard for brick, as well as wood frame houses in the Federal period and later. Baltimore's Homewood is typical. We'll now switch to several architectural details and motifs used to accent colonial houses. For starters, we'll return to Wilton for a look at its architecturally distinguished doorway, shown here in its former stone color. Now, since this photograph was taken, paint experts have determined that the doorway and all the rest of Wilton's exterior trim was originally a dark red, as we saw earlier. The doorway consists of two Ionic pilasters supporting a pediment, a form defined as an aedicule. So where do we get this strange term? For the answer, we'll have to go to ancient Rome. Actually, the example I'm using is in Pompeii. However, nearly every Roman house had a small shrine set into the wall of a principal space, displaying an image of the guardian household god. The image, either a painting or a sculpture or even a mosaic, was framed by a small pediment supported on two small columns, or sometimes pilasters. This form is called an aedicule. Aedes is the Latin word for house or even a temple. Aedicule is the diminutive form of Aedes, or a little house or temple. To the Romans, the shrine's frame resembled a little temple. During the Renaissance, the edicule form was adapted for doorways and window surrounds. The form became especially popular in the 18th century, also for doorways and window surrounds. We see the edicule adapted for a window frame on Drayton Hall, and for a doorway on a London 18th century Georgian terrace house. Wilton's doorway, like Drayton Hall's window, is based on a doorway design published in one of the numerous English architectural pattern books used by builders in colonial America, in this case William Salmon's Palladio Londinensis. Wilton's builders, however, substituted a triangular pediment for a segmental one, probably because it was easier to make. One of the country's most famous colonial doorways is found on Westover, seen now with its 19th century shutters removed. Like Wilton, the doorway is based on a design found in Palladio Londinensis, a doorway using the composite order. Instead of a triangular pediment, the design is crowned by scrolled cornices framing a Roman pine cone, a symbol of fertility and longevity. Westover's doorway material is actually stone. The whole composition was made in England and imported to Virginia in the 18th century. It's long been painted, leading many to assume it's wood. This design has been copied and adapted countless times. We see a version of it on a colonial revival house designed by William Lawrence Bottomley, and a near replica in marble on the Museum of the City of New York in Manhattan. An ambitious folk version graces a colonial house in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and a modern commercial version, seen on the right, can be purchased from an architectural supply company. The availability of numerous pattern books, builders' manuals, and architectural treatises was critical to the development of colonial architecture. The American colonies could barely claim a handful of professional architects. The publications provided the information, instructions, and visuals needed by builders to produce literate works. Their schemes were often enhanced through dialogue with their clients, especially if the clients themselves were informed on the subject of architecture and possessed architectural publications which could be costly. Among the more influential of these publications were the two works by the prominent British architect James Gibbs. These were A Book of Architecture of 1728 and Rules for Drawing the Several Parts of Architecture of 1732. In the introduction to A Book of Architecture, Gibbs wrote, quote, "They were of the opinion that such a work as this would be of use to such gentlemen as might be concerned with building, especially in the remote parts of the country, where little or no assistance in drawings can be procured." Well, of course, the most remote parts of the country then were the American colonies. We see here how one of Gibbs's published designs for a country house was adapted for the design of Mount Airy, a Virginia plantation house. Though reduced in size from the published scheme, it maintains the Anglo-Palladian character for which Gibbs was a leading proponent. Likewise, the center section of the Sheldon House in Litchfield, Connecticut, consists of a Palladian window set on an entablature supported by 4 columns. This feature most likely was also derived from a published Gibbs design. Because strict copyright laws did not exist in the 18th century, it's not surprising to see many of Gibbs's published drawings being plagiarized by other pattern book authors and published under their own name. One of the bolder of these plagiarizers was an English architect named Batty Langley, who churned out as many as 16 pattern books, most very useful works, but some with a number of plates lifted from other sources. A popular Langley work was A Treasury of Designs of 1740, a book widely used in the colonies. It was more obtainable and considerably less expensive than Gibbs's books. We see such copying in Langley's Ionic doorway, looking suspiciously like a design by James Gibbs, published in his Book of Architecture. And Langley audaciously labeled his illustration, "The measures invented, proportioned, and affixed by Batty Langley, 1739. So do we credit Gibbs or Langley for Pohick Church's doorway design, where George Washington was a vestryman? More than likely, the mason who crafted the doorway was working from Langley's more affordable book rather than Gibbs's. Such plagiarisms makes it difficult to determine which publication was the source for a particular colonial detail. We see it again with the plates of two Ionic capitals. The Langley illustration is essentially identical to Gibbs's, yet Langley captions it as, quote, "Langley invent, 1739, unquote. So was Gibbs or Langley the source for the Ionic column capitals on King's Chapel in Boston, designed by Peter Harrison? Nonetheless, Langley was a competent designer. I think we can credit him with this Palladian window. It's distinguished by its broken pediment framing a rusticated arch. This design is not found in any other of the pattern books generally available in the colonies. And of course, this design is the source for the window lighting George Washington's large dining room at Mount Vernon, a celebrated detail of 18th century American architecture. Before we leave our discussion on exteriors, I want to say a brief word about porticos. We owe it to Palladio the idea of adding a portico to a house. The ancient Romans reserved porticos for temples and public buildings. They rarely, if ever, applied porticos to a domestic work. For Palladio, this ancient device gave a residence a dignity of appearance. And Palladio can also be regarded as the likely innovator of the two-tiered portico, which proved to be especially popular in the southern colonies. Porticos on colonial houses are very rare, but we have two famous South Carolina colonial mansions fronted by two-tiered porticos, Drayton Hall and Charleston's Miles Bruton House. In Virginia, Jefferson attempted to set an example for referencing Palladio's villas with his first version of Monticello. His elevation drawing called for a two-tier portico employing academically correct use of the Doric and Ionic orders. Though reduced in size, the scheme was inspired by Palladio's Villa Canaro. Jefferson, of course, later remodeled Monticello into the dome design, which we can see on the nickel. What may be the colonial period's earliest example of a regular temple-type portico applied to a dwelling is on Whitehall, built in the 1760s near Annapolis, and attributed to the architect-builder William Buckland. All right, for the last part of this presentation, we'll concentrate on colonial interiors. This is an enormous subject to cover with limited time, but we can hit some highlights that may be useful design resources for current practitioners. We'll first look at a colonial floor plan. This is the first floor plan of the Wythe House, the exterior we saw earlier. It's a double pile plan, meaning that the house is 2 rooms deep. The plan is rigidly symmetrical, with pairs of rooms framing a generous through passage or stair hall. The 2 best rooms occupy the front pile and are slightly larger than the 2 rooms on the garden side. Such a plan reflects the rigidly rational mindset of the 18th century. In the same spirit, but slightly different, is the floor plan of Westover. We saw Westover's exterior earlier. Here the wide center passage is off-center by 1 bay. This allows the 2 best rooms to be 1 bay wider than the 2 left rooms. I should note that in the early 20th century, the 2 left rooms were united into a single space by the removal of the separating partition. Westover's fully paneled hall is an airy, generously proportioned space. Its ceiling is highlighted by decorative plasterwork employing Rococo details. Dominating the space is an impressive stair with spiral-carved balusters. Contrasting with the formal plans of the Wythe House in Westover is the plan of a typical late 17th century New England house. This plan type continued in use in New England into the 18th century, even on some high-style houses. Here the dwelling, central fireplaces, and their flues are consolidated into a massive central masonry structure, as we discussed earlier. Such a floor plan prohibits a through center passage, hence one is greeted by a compact stair upon entering. We have a late 17th century example of this effect in the Langdon Warner House in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Here the stair ascends with narrow winders. The ceiling has exposed joists, typical of the early New England vernacular. But the stair is lent sophistication with the use of double balusters in its railing. Now, by double balusters, I mean each baluster has vertical symmetry, using two bulbous turnings or bellies, one atop the other. We see similar double balusters in the railing of an early 18th century house in Virginia. A double baluster is not an ancient motif, but is a Renaissance innovation. An early example of its use is the balustrade of Donato Bramati's Tempietto in Rome, completed in 1510. It's believed that the form was inspired by Roman candlesticks, as seen in the entablature of Rome's Temple of Portunus, as recorded by Antoine de Godet. The use of the double baluster in colonial stair railings did not last much past the early 18th century. The more typical colonial baluster has only one bulbous turning or belly, as seen in a stair railing in Independence Hall. And we'll discuss this baluster form shortly, but first we need to look at stair types. Here we see what is called a closed string colonial stair, meaning that the ends of the risers and treads are covered by a stringer or string board. In this example, the stringer takes the form of a two-fascia architrave. The closed string stair contrasts with an open string stair, where the ends of the risers and treads are exposed. The open string stair is common to many colonial houses, particularly ones dating from the second half of the 18th century. The balusters here are in the form of what is termed vase and column balusters. The form consists of a tall plinth supporting a single baluster or vase, which is topped by a thin column, and we saw a similar version of this in Independence Hall. Here the column heights vary to accommodate the railing's angle of rise and to keep the vases and plinths aligned. Note also that the ends of the steps are decorated with applied scroll brackets. Colonial stair designs often follow illustrations in English pattern books, such as those by William Payne, whose several works were sold in America. In this Payne design, the stair brackets are enriched with carved ornaments. The inspiration for these carved brackets comes from the scroll modillions in the Corinthian cornice. A close-up of a modillion reveals how its form and details were copied quite faithfully for the stair brackets in Drayton Hall. And consistent with Drayton's grandiose character, its stair balusters are unusually complex. The profile of the Corinthian modillion also served as the inspiration for the profile of many undecorated stair brackets, such as those on Mount Vernon stair. And Mount Vernon stair balusters are plain as well, just elongated columns set on compressed vases and short plinths. As we are seeing, colonial stair balusters come in infinite variety, exhibiting the whim and dexterity of the colonial turner. In this example, the vases have additional turnings. The columns are shorter than usual and have extra taper. Stair railings in high-style New England houses can sometimes go over the top, providing demonstrations of the colonial craftsman's virtuosity. In the Longfellow house, the balusters have two forms of twisting, and the newel is a bold spiral wrapping a slender post. A feature reserved for the stairs of some very grand houses is the scrolled soffit. Instead of treating the underside of a flight of stairs as a flat soffit, the underside of each step continues the step's profile, creating a wavy surface. A famous example is the hanging flight of stairs in Shirley. A later example is the double flight of stairs in the Chase Lloyd house in Annapolis. The stairs and other interior embellishments in this house are the work of William Buckland. A special treatment found on some colonial stairs is the Chinese lattice railing, an expression of one of the exotic fashions popular in 18th century England. The Chinese mode was disseminated through various pattern books, but also in furniture designs made and published by Thomas Chippendale. This has led people to refer to Chinese lattice as Chinese Chippendale, but Chinese lattice is the preferred, more general term. A stair designed by William Halfpenny was the source of the Chinese lattice stair railing in Battersea, a Petersburg, Virginia house, the exterior of which is in a 5-part Palladian format. A notably complex Chinese lattice pattern highlights the Stair Hall of Bohemia, a 1745 Maryland plantation house. While rare, such stairs are marks of the high quality attained in some colonial works. The use of fanciful stair railings began to pass out of fashion in the 1780s in favor of leaner design. Typical of this new approach is the railing in Grovemount, a 1780s Virginia house. The railing here is composed of plain square pickets, but given a bit of character by being set on a diagonal. Interestingly, some of our 20th century colonial revival architects were partial to spiral staircases, even though spiral staircases were rarely, if ever, used in actual colonial period houses. Spiral staircases generally were a feature of houses of the Federal period and later. Architect William Lawrence Bottomley and his clients were particularly fond of these elegant stairs. He rarely missed an opportunity to install one in an otherwise strictly mid-18th century style work. We see two Richmond examples. Having dealt with staircases, we can now proceed to colonial wall treatments. Finer colonial houses make use of wood paneling for wall covering. In this 1770 interior, full paneling covers the fireplace wall. Partial or half paneling is used for the remaining walls, as seen on the left, leaving a section of plaster surface above the chair rail, sometimes covered with wallpaper. In this room, we see a series of panels above the chair rail, which is a regional variant. Well, why paneling? The tradition of covering walls with special materials or fabrics can be traced to the Middle Ages. In important castles or manor houses, the stone walls were frequently hung with tapestries to add warmth and decoration. Also, the tapestries covered over window openings because it was believed that the night air carried disease. Many of these tapestries were works of art and more prized than paintings. In the Tudor period, permanently fixed wooden panels began to take the place of tapestries. A common decoration of the panels was linen fold carving. That is, the panels were carved to resemble pieces of cloth with flat folds. Linen fold passed out of fashion towards the mid-17th century in favor of fielded panels. That is, panels with flat fields and beveled edges which fit into slots or grooves in the rails and stiles. This allowed the panels to expand and contract with temperature changes and thus avoid splitting. Note in the diagram that the rails and stiles were fastened with tongue and groove joints secured with wooden pegs. And this diagram from the Philadelphia Carpenter Company's price book shows the hierarchy of panel types, from the simplest and least expensive to the finest, most costly version shown in the lower right, one embellished with additional moldings. Looking again at the Eppington fireplace wall, we see the arrangement of the panels echoing classical design. The long vertical panel atop a shorter panel below the chair rail suggests a column set on a pedestal. Note, too, that the mantel is in the form of a classical entablature. The 18th century builders' manuals and pattern books indeed based panel proportions on the classical orders. Batty Langley's Builder's Jewel illustrates panel schemes reflecting the characteristics of three classical orders. This reference to the orders is reflected in the paneling of a Wilton bedroom, seen on the left. The scale of colonial paneling, of course, varies regionally. Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, New York, exhibits this point. It has fine paneling in its parlor, complete with fluted pilasters and an arched opening, but in deference to Long Island's chilly winters, the first-floor ceilings are quite low, about 8 feet. The mannequin on the left provides a scaled figure. We compare it with Wilton's parlor, a room with similar detailing, but with a ceiling height of 12 feet. Such a handsomely articulated room can offer inspiration for a colonial revival interior. We see how its essential character and detailing have been adapted for the design of the 1930s Colonial Revival Library in Milburn, a bottomly designed house. Colonial paneling, especially paneled fireplace walls, can have much individual character within the classical system. In the 1770s Harewood, the chimney piece is treated with a single, exceptionally large panel, framed by fluted Doric pilasters set on pedestals. The composition, employing a full Doric entablature with pulvinated frieze, is carried around the fully paneled room, echoing what we saw both in Wilton and the Milburn Library. We see a similar arrangement in the fireplace wall of Smith's Fort, a modest 18th century house. Its composition makes use of stock-fluted Doric pilasters on pedestals, supporting an academically correct entablature with dentil molding. Flanking the pilasters are arch-top cupboards. This sophisticated design is comparable to what might find in a London townhouse of the period. As with most colonial rooms, the fireplace has no mantel or mantel shelf. Mantel shelves generally did not become common features until the 1770s. The paneled chimney piece in Marmion, a 1740s wood frame house preserving a rare full-length porch, has just a simple molding framing its fireplace opening, and no mantel shelf, but the opening is given a bit of style by the use of a segmental arch cutout. A striking contrast to the otherwise provincial treatment of this room is Marmion's parlor, one of colonial America's most elegant interior spaces. Its pilasters are faithfully rendered in Palladio's enriched Ionic order. The marbleizing and decorative paintings were added in the 1770s. This room has been a main attraction of the Metropolitan Museum's American Wing since the 1920s. Such sophistication was hardly confined to Virginia. The interior of the Isaac Royal House in Medford, Massachusetts, is a display of colonial architectural artistry at its best. It's also a rare colonial use of the Corinthian order. The fireplace here is highlighted by a crosseted architrave frame, and Delft tiles line the firebox. By the 1760s, paneled walls were passing out of fashion in favor of finely finished plaster surfaces. Kenmore's dining room features plastered walls finely articulated by intricately ornamented plaster frames. The room's plasterwork ceiling is perhaps the finest of the entire colonial period. And note that the fireplace here has a mantel shelf and a richly carved frieze. Although it's a reconstruction, Williamsburg's Governor's Palace exhibits the use of colonial-style wallpaper. 18th century wallpaper was all imported and could either be patterned or solid colored. Solid colored wallpapers were normally applied in squares rather than strips. If you look carefully at the papered walls of the palace's supper room, you might see the seams of the squares. And the paper is framed on top and bottom by patterned borders of gold leaf papier-mâché. I want now to return to the aedicule to make a point about another interior architectural feature. As we see in this historic photograph of an 18th century Charleston chimney piece, the overmantel is in the form of an aedicule, that is, two pilasters supporting a pediment, in this case a broken pediment. This type of chimney piece, consisting of an aedicule form above the mantel, was inspired by illustrations in pattern books such as Batty Langley's Treasury of Designs. You recall that the aedicule was originally a frame for a shrine in an ancient Roman house, displaying an image of the guardian household god. So perhaps we should add a couple of gods to better make the point. Now, the Latin word for fireplace or hearth is focus. The fireplace was the focus or focal point of an ancient interior, providing warmth and a gathering place. And if we regard the hearth as the heart of the house, the aedicule with its images of guardian gods can perhaps be regarded as the soul of the house. So we have in this one architectural composition the symbolic heart and soul of the house. Of course, in America, we normally don't display images of gods in the overmantel, but usually images of ancestors, who are often revered as the guardian spirit of the house. Most would say that a room without a fireplace lacks focus, and it certainly has no soul. Adding a full-fledged chimney piece does instill some heart and soul to the space, and certainly provides a focal point. Some of the most splendid versions of chimney piece compositions were found in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the colonial period's largest and most prosperous city. Its artisans produced beautiful interiors as well as furniture. Outstanding were the interiors of the Powell House, a 1765 townhouse, the home of Samuel Powell, a prominent 18th century Philadelphia mayor. Its parlor woodwork was sold to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1925, where it is now displayed. Its chimney piece exhibits the apex of colonial American artistry and craftsmanship. The subject of interior details and features is multifarious. We've had time to explore only some of the more conspicuous features. Before concluding, however, I would like to examine one more detail, the modillion. In fact, three specific types of modillions, two of which are encountered in colonial interiors. The third appears on some colonial exteriors. I'm still trying to find it used in a colonial interior. I'm sure it's there, I just haven't found it yet. The first type is the simple scroll modillion, usually associated with the Ionic order. We see it in Palladio's version of the Ionic, as illustrated in his treatise. It's a projecting bracket given some character by having its underside or soffit cut with a simple scroll, probably to provide some visual character or even a drip edge. Palladio's source for this modillion was likely the Temple of Saturn order, which he measured and illustrated in his treatise. Palladio used this type of modillion on the entablature of the Villa Rotunda, and the form was picked up, probably from Palladio, by the English pattern book writers such as William Salmon, whose book was widely used in America. A plate such as his was likely the source for the modillions and entablature in Carter's Grove. Next, in Gunston Hall, we see some stumpy modillions in the cornice of the Chinese room. Now, they have nothing to do with Chinese architecture. Rather, they are an ancient Roman motif called block modillions, We see them on the secondary cornices of the Pantheon. These too were measured and published, and indeed popularized by Palladio. We define them as cyma recta block modillions. Cyma means S-curve, recta means straight. The curve of a cyma recta block modillion starts off straight or horizontally and ends up horizontally. The cyma recta block modillion is illustrated in Colonial Londinensis, a book owned by William Buckland, who executed the Gunston Hall interiors. And George Washington must have gotten a discount on cyma recta block modillions because they're spread all over Mount Vernon's center passage. Well, this leads us to the cyma reversa block modillion. A primary ancient source for this detail is a cornice on Rome's Temple of Mars Ultor, also published and popularized by Palladio. The cyma reversa block modillion starts off vertically and ends vertically. And this detail too found its way into works of the English pattern book writers, and again in William Salmon's Colonial Londinensis. As noted, I've yet to find a colonial period cyma reversa block modillion applied to an interior cornice, but I have discovered its use in a particularly intimate colonial setting. They decorate the cornices of Mount Vernon's two privies. And I can only say that this is probably a unique use of this distinctive ancient motif. Before we close this session, I want to briefly review some of the publications mentioned in this presentation, and also a couple of additional sources useful for more in-depth information on colonial architecture. First and foremost is Andrea Palladio's 1570 I Quattro Libri, or the Four Books on Architecture. This was a primary reference for classical architecture in the 18th century, in both Britain and America. We see how Palladio's illustration of a Roman villa directly influenced the design of a colonial plantation house. Now, fortunately, the book is available in inexpensive reprint, in this case of a 1738 English language rare edition of Palladio's treatise. Likewise, James Gibbs's A Book of Architecture was a leading source for Anglo-American Palladianism. His country house designs were adapted for colonial works. This too is available in inexpensive reprint. Gibbs's rules for drawing the several parts of architecture served as the main textbook for classical design for both architects and builders. This too is finally available in inexpensive reprints. Thomas Jefferson owned rules and used Gibbs's illustration of a Doric entablature for the Monticello tea room. For some unknown reason, Gibbs advocated replacing 8 guttae in the mutual soffit with a tab, and this started a trend in both Britain and America. Look for it. Its source is Gibbs's rules. I've mentioned Batty Langley's book several times. The title of the most popular of his several works, The City and Country Builders and Workmen's Treasury of Designs, clearly indicates that the book was aimed at the people doing the work of building. Example of Langley's influence can be seen in every one of the 13 colonies. The complete book of nearly 200 plates is available online. Along with Langley's books are those by William Salmon, also widely used by colonial builders, as we've seen, especially Palladio Londinensis. It too is available online. Abraham Swan's The British Architect was a more costly book and contained more high-style designs of both interior and exterior features. It's available in inexpensive reprint, but a better quality copy of the original is also found online. For a comprehensive examination of colonial architecture in a specific region, I give high praise to the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for its brilliant work, The Chesapeake House. Nearly all aspects of colonial building and design are covered in this handsome work, including design sources, construction, labor, materials, finishes, hardware, and more. Finally, a source often overlooked are the records of the Historic American Building Survey of the Library of Congress, commonly referred to as HABS. The program was established in 1933 with the goal to record the nation's historic buildings with measured drawings, photographs, and written text. The surveys now cover some 43,000 places, all of which are online. These records also served as design resources for architects practicing in historic styles, especially colonial revival, and can be useful to architects today. For example, we see a sampling of measured drawings for Toddsbury, a colonial Virginia house, including elevations, plans, and interior details. Adaptations of American colonial styles continue to be popular today, especially for domestic works. There is an innate appeal for the honest dignity, scale, and details that the colonial styles offer, all rooted in the classical tradition. Through its various programs, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art fosters the literate use of traditional styles, including our own colonial. A strong market exists for informed use of the colonial idiom for contemporary residences. To illustrate, I will end with 3 recent works by firms affiliated with or honored by the ICAA. First, A Dignified Stone Residence by Ellen Greenberg, Gil Schaefer's Gambrel Roof Country House, and finally, A Stately Mansion by the firm of Ferguson and Chimneys. Well, I'm Calder Loth, and I hope this presentation has given you a more informed appreciation of our priceless heritage of colonial architecture, and will enhance the works of today's practitioners of the style. Thank you.